TopMedTalk. Welcome to TopMedTalk. I'm Andy Cumpstey and I'm at EBPOM World Congress in London. This is a new series. We're going to start hopefully hearing more from people about their journeys through perioperative medicine with our Periop Profiles. And I'm absolutely delighted that we've got Professor Paul Myles here to start the series off. Thanks for joining us, Paul.
Good afternoon, Andy. Very pleased to be here.
You're currently now the Director of Research at the Alfred Hospital.
Oh, well, I've got a sort of joint hospital-university appointment. So I'm also the head of department in the university, Department of Anaesthesiology, Perioperative Medicine. So it's really nice to have that kind of mix. I've always had a very strong academic component to how I work in the hospital, in the operating theatres themselves. So I do a couple of days a week in the operating theatres. The rest of the time is all academia.
Brilliant. So I'm really keen to hear about how we get into the research space. I mean, so you're in Melbourne now, but you grew up in Melbourne as well, is that right?
Yeah. I was sort of born and bred in Melbourne, went to all sorts of different schools. Ended up at Monash University where I did medical training. I was a resident in Melbourne, and all through that residency, my whole ambition was to be a country GP.
Really?
So the whole thing was being a family doctor on the coast, spending all my spare time surfing and fishing. And in that residency training, of course, I wanted to do extra obstetric training. So I did 6 months DIPOBS, did some pediatrics, I did some intensive care, did some general practice. And I thought I need to get some anaesthesia training, especially in rural or regional Australia. So I came across to the UK in the mid-1980s in the era of Ian Botham playing cricket, and he slaughtered the Australian team game after game after game. I was an SHO in Taunton in Somerset. So cricket was big there in that era. I loved that year. I loved the UK. And I did 1 year of anaesthesia and totally fell in love with the specialty. That changed my whole idea about the sort of doctor I wanted to be. So, you did all the usual things you do when you're young. I backpacked around Europe for a year, came back to Melbourne, and I got a second year anaesthetic registrar job at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne. The one hospital that I hated as a medical student because I was going to be a country GP and I thought it was high-tech, surgeon-dominated hospital, but I now live right in the middle of that environment.
Where did that country GP idea come from? Were your parents medical? Was that something you saw looking up to there?
I was brought up with a single mum, had siblings, of course. We struggled a lot, went from school to school and home to home. And she said to me when I was very young, when you grow up, you could be a doctor. So I, being a responsible young little kid, I just had this lifelong ambition to be a doctor. That's where it all started, I guess.
And surfing's always been, and still is, I believe, a big passion of yours.
Yeah, I'm actually a surfer. I'm a part-time doctor.
Is that where the country GP bit came from? That it was part of being near the sea, near the waves, near the beach?
To me, testosterone-fueled teenage boy, the idea of surfing and living on the coast, being a doctor, doing all the things I love, was just the perfect lifelong ambition.
And so somehow you make the transition, you're going to go to medical school and you're going to apply. How does that work in Australia? You apply for lots? Do you apply for one or two? Was it always going to be Melbourne or?
I was a good student. I did study hard. I did have this intense ambition to get into medical school. So that, I was lucky that happened. And then I bummed around like everyone does through university, just realised all I got to do was pass. And that was enough. So I had a good life. It was all great. But as I said, I came to the UK and just started doing anaesthesia. This is the most fantastic job.
Well, what triggered that UK trip then?
Oh, it was probably a sense of adventure, probably is the real reason. But there was an opportunity to apply for jobs in the UK as an SHO. I knew nothing about anaesthesia. I knew nothing about Taunton. I knew a little bit about the UK and I knew a lot about cricket. So I just rocked up and just, as I said, fell into the job. The registrars, the consultants there at the time were all just really lovely. Very social environment, a lot of times at the pub. But the work was truly fascinating. It was just fantastic.
I don't know if I've told you this, but that was where I did my first F1 job in Taunton as well. It's an amazing place. You arrived in the UK.
Yes, I went from a beautiful Melbourne midsummer, so, say 30 degrees sunny every day, and arrived in Taunton, and this is late January.
Yeah. I think I should say for us, Taunton's sunny south coast. It's warm for the UK, right? Even in January. But I mean...
Well, you might say that, but for someone from Australia, I, in my whole life, never owned an umbrella or a jacket. That is absolutely for real. I arrived in jeans, I had a jumper, and I simply was just totally culturally shocked. I mean, I was stunned. I rocked up to the hospital house that we were provided with, and there were stalactites hanging off the entrance. And I Like, well, this is just not
much ice in Melbourne.
real. Despite that, I was looking forward to the impending spring and summer, and eventually it came. And in that year, I remember this vividly. It rained every single day of September. Of August, winter seemed to start again. I thought, you can't live like this. That is not summer. And now I've got another 10 months of winter.
You survived a year in our wet British climate.
Yes.
And that was where the anaesthesia bug came from.
Because, I mean, as I said, it was a really social time. There was an opportunity to sit what at that time was the old primary exams, and that was the last exam that was going to be recognised by the college back in Australia. So out of the blue, I just took this opportunity. I thought, even though, as I said, I wanted to be a country GP and I was only going to do 1 year of anaesthesia, suddenly I thought, I can sit this exam. If I sit this exam, then I might be able to get a specialty training job in Melbourne. So I literally started about 6 or 8 weeks before the primary exam and just studied.
I got it.
I do remember in the pub after passing and having my first Guinness. It was fantastic.
And then after a year of you decided enough and back to Melbourne.
Yeah, so I came back to Melbourne and arrived at the Alfred Hospital, surgeon-dominated hospital, good range of surgeries. It was a lovely anaesthetic department there. But I arrived, as I said, I'd come from the English system where there was very much this culture of publish or perish. Joes had to do some sort of research to get a registrar job or an SR job, and then beyond that, a consultant job. Doing some research was just a real part of the culture. I came back to Melbourne and everyone's going, what are you even thinking? Like, there was just no sense of anyone doing any research or having any interest research. And I had this, I think, a high motivation to come back and do some. I think I truly wanted to. It wasn't just for career reasons. To the credit of the anaesthetic department that I was in, they were very open and supportive and they allowed me. But I literally had to come up with the ideas, design it all, and literally started off doing it all by myself.
You got that bug in the UK then? I don't know. I would assume it was the other way around and you got it when you went back to the Alfred. But
no, it came very much from the UK system.
So what was it about the research that why was it such a burning thing you had to do that when you went back to Melbourne?
I don't think I've ever properly sort of, considered the why part of it. But I think for me, I was fascinated by anaesthesia and I was learning the technical skills and understanding, the pharmacology and all these aspects. And the great thing about that specialty is you do something and you see a result immediately. And that is really great. And that's one of the things I loved about it. But with that, of course, comes all these questions like, why am I using this drug rather than that drug? Why do some of the consultants have this anaesthetic technique and others have a different technique? And they all can explain it really well. But I'm thinking, well, how do we actually show improvements in care, or how can we improve outcomes for the patient? I had questions around physiology, pharmacology, and so on. And I went back to Australia really thinking I just want to do some research to try and answer some of these questions.
So what were the first questions you chose to look at?
Back in the early days, they were a bit more sort of pharmacology, physiology based. So probably very traditional anesthesia research that's still many are carrying out to this day. They're measuring sort of surrogate outcomes or measures of effect that are of interest to me, the anaesthetist, but perhaps not so important or interesting to the patient themselves, particularly when you're thinking about outcome and recovery. But, there's scientific questions. You have a hypothesis, you do a sample size calculation, you do a whole lot of measurements and you write up a paper. And then you send it off to journals and learn about rejection, and then you eventually have success.
Well, I was going to ask about rejection a bit later, I might come back to that. But all the things you've just talked about with, you just do the sample size, the power calculation, you don't just do that. Someone like you that's done this over the years, many, many, many times now, you just do that. But for most people starting out, that's a huge thing to just do. How do you come back from a year in the UK to a department that doesn't do research and start doing that?
Well, I think in that era, many would recall in the primary exam at that point, the statistics was one of the things you had to learn. So I studied and tried to understand it. It was a great struggle, I must say. But the idea of doing a research project, I at least realised you need to have or follow the recipe. So you've got textbooks, and I read about how to design up a trial. And these are very small projects at the time, very simple ones. But in that, you could do the calculation. And again, most of this was not done by computer. You had to do some calculations to do some of this stuff. But you learn very basic skills, but enough to have a little bit of success. And some of these were just straight observational studies as well. I published a few, mostly very minor things as a registrar.
And what did your colleagues think about this? Were they keen to jump on the bandwagon and get on board?
Not so much initially. There's certainly good support, and I was in a nice environment where I had the support and freedom to do these things. Some collaborated, but otherwise you could literally do it all by yourself, really. You just manually enroll the patients, you manually collect the data in the everyday cases you're doing. That type of thing. But through the anaesthesia training, of course, I had to pass the second part 2 exam as well. In that time, I felt like I really need to have better research skill. Insight led to me when I became a consultant after doing a number of modest research projects. The first thing I want to do is actually truly understand statistics and trial design. So I effectively, as a first-year consultant, enrolled immediately into a part-time Master of Public Health, majoring in epidemiology and statistics, because I wanted that basic skill. And I thought of it very much like doing a primary exam in physiology, pharmacology makes you a much better anaesthetist. So it was the same principle. And I just felt if I could fully understand statistics through that course and training, not just a matter of you, in fact, were taught properly some of these things. You also had access to actual statisticians and people who were doing clinical trials. So I got to have a little bit of both mentorship, which is always important, and having access to the expertise I needed to do better quality research. I had a better understanding of what better quality research needed to be. And part of that was, of course, becoming more collaborative, doing it as a bit more team-based work. And then I designed what I would label as the first better quality small clinical trial. But again, they were single centre initially. And I very quickly learned that to do anything truly meaningful and get into publishing a really good journal, you needed to sort of do something that's practice changing. You have to have an impact on patient outcomes.
And you mentioned rejection earlier. Did you learn that through rejection?
One of my great regrets, I was told this by, it might have been one of my mentors in that very early phase, that you should keep all your rejection letters. And this is back in the era where it wasn't, web-based sending off to journals. This was all handwritten, paper-based submissions. And then, months sometimes turnaround waiting for the eventual rejection. My big regret is that I should have kept all those rejection letters, because I think people look at me and think, oh, gee, Paul Myles, he's very successful. He's so good. It's all so easy. I can assure anybody that it was never easy. It always required a thick hide to overcome those challenges, to overcome the naysayers and the people are saying, you're not good enough, or anesthesia is not real research, or anaesthetists can't do good research. These issues, I've heard them over and over again, and every single time, all it did was make me feel stronger, or just push me a little bit harder to really demonstrate that, in fact, we can do that sort of research. We can have an impact and can publish in very good journals. But I would have loved to wallpapered my office with rejection letters.
That's interesting for people to hear, isn't it? I think it's easy for people to see the success, but you saying you can wallpaper your whole house with rejection letters. Are there any particular ones that stand out? Do you remember or really hurt a lot?
The journal ones, I think I was always sufficiently I understood that it was a challenge. You had to prove and explain why a particular study is important enough to be published in a journal. The one rejection letter, which I think is worth highlighting, was actually in a research grant application. And again, I've had a share of rejections over the years. But when I was still relatively junior, so at this stage, I was just completing that master degree in public health, and I was actually now doing wanting to do good clinical trials. So my very first NHMRC research grant application that I put in, perhaps a bit naively, I had a good team. I had some proper expert researchers as part of it. That grant application was a failure, and the opening line from the letter that came back to me said, "This application is very surprising because it comes from an anaesthetist and they don't do research." That was the opening line. I should have kept that one. I read that line and I thought, okay, I'm not going to criticize that person, certainly not the process. The criticism lies, I felt, with us as a specialty in that we haven't got we didn't, at least in that person's eyes, have the reputation and respect that I felt we deserved, because I knew plenty of anaesthetists, including the ones that are obviously purely clinical, and I know they're really good doctors and I know they can do good research. So that was the great challenge for me.
And how do you pick yourself up from a line like that?
Just visualize that person, and I like to visualize them now today and compare my H index with whatever their H index was during that time. But I felt the challenge was mine. I mean, it was up to design better research, write better grant applications, be as strong as possible in what we were trying to do, truly have an impact, which is what all researchers want to have.
You mentioned you went to the UK, came back to Australia. But what about family? Do you have children at this point?
Yeah, so I came to the UK with my wife, Sarah. That was a wonderful experience together. And she's been amazingly supportive, both for me and, of course, she's got her own writing career, which is quite different to my own. So we came back to Australia and we had 3 gorgeous children over the next number of years. First 2 during my registrar years and our third when I was a young consultant. So all of that was happening at the same time. And of course, I think most doctors, you've got to juggle home time, work time, got to pass exams. We had to do a lot of on-call on weekends. And in all of that, I was trying to develop and build a research experience and a career as well. I just felt that you can manage all of that. Obviously, you're needing a lot of support by others, but having the balance that suited me personally, and it might be different for many others, working out how much of I should commit myself to that professional development versus being a good anaesthetist otherwise, and of course having a home life and continue the surfing through the process.
Are they all keen surfers as well?
We all love the coast. It was one of the reasons that attracted me to Somerset, of course.
Where did the collaborative idea come from?
Because I had this early emerging reputation of being a young researcher, I got to know some other people doing some research around Australia. One in particular I'd like to name is John Rigg, a consultant anaesthetist from Perth. He'd spent some years in Canada at McMaster. He had a great understanding of good clinical trials because of the expertise that centre right from the 80s, or maybe 70s even. He had this idea of doing this big randomised trial to really evaluate the benefits of epidural analgesia in abdominal surgery. So it was his idea, it was his ambition, and he contacted me and said, look, would you like to be part of this project? And he and I both fully understood that to do that, it needed to be multi-centred. And we had to convince other sites across Australia, New Zealand, and in that Asia that they would be part of this collaboration. So a lot of the work was done by him. He was in contact with an epidemiologist statistician at University of Western Australia. So they were the sort of the core of it. And there was himself in Melbourne. Of course, had other connections across the region. Together, we built up a network of about 10 or 12 hospitals initially, and then others joined in, and that was all part of the master trial. And what was mine and John's, but I was the lead investigator. That was our very first NHMRC research grant, and that funded our first multi-centre clinical trial.
What do you remember?
Mid-90s. And that, I think, was about 750,000, which at the time was a lot of money. That was a very big grant by NHMRC standards. And in fact, it was the first trial that had ever been funded in anaesthesia, other types of anaesthesia research.
The feel of a big organisation like that, which has previously said, anaesthetists don't do research, suddenly giving you that huge amount of money.
Yeah, well, I think now, I didn't really understand it fully at the time, but I look back now and realise that we sort of broke down the door. We suddenly had some reputation and status at the NHMRC level. And with the success of the master trial as we enrolled patients and eventually completed it, and obviously eventually published in The Lancet, which was a major achievement for all of us, that process, it gave a roadmap really, saying we've got something here that we should take full advantage of it. We've got a network of hospitals who want to be part of this trial. We need to design the next trial, take full advantage of all that experience and connectivity. Our next big question, which I led, was the Be Aware trial, looking at the value of BIS monitoring to prevent awareness. That at the time was a very open question. It was contested. Every other study in the past had tried to demonstrate a monitor for awareness that works, that all failed. I felt that we could design the trial to properly evaluate. The trial turned out beautiful and exactly according to what we had planned and hoped. And that was also published in The Lancet a few years after. That really set us up, really.
And that's another great example there. You say lots of other trials had looked at trying to do that and not managed it.
Yeah.
It'd been quite easy to have been put off by that and choose a different topic.
And we had a visiting professor from the UK, I might say, I won't name names, who came to our hospital and gave a talk. And in it, he made the point that it is impossible to design a study to show that a monitor would prevent awareness. And my great teaching in epidemiology and trial design and so on realised that that in fact was a false statement or a belief that was not based on proper understanding of statistics and clinical trial design. I realised what was needed to do that trial. It required a sample size calculation and these other components. We needed to identify a high-risk population so that we got full value for the patients that were being enrolled. We designed it up and it was incredibly successful. And at the time, it was a really hot topic in the specialty of anaesthesia. So there was a lot of buy-in from colleagues across the network that we had. And then the network grew and grew because a lot of people wanted to be part of this new success story.
The network we're talking about here is the ANZCA Clinical Trials Network.
Yeah, so again, that first trial I mentioned, the master trial that was published in the Lancet in 2002, and that trial group then became the Be Aware trial group, which was the same group but bigger. And I realised around early 2000s that we need to actually have a more formalised clinical trial group that we could then tap in these new big trials under the same system. And ideally, that shouldn't be Paul Myles' trial or the Alfred Hospital trial or Monash University. We designed it so that it would be actually under the governance of the Australian New Zealand College of Anaesthetists. So it's a college entity of itself. It's for the fellowship, the specialty itself. It was set up in a way that there was representation and a broader group on the steering committee and so on. And we just needed to have it linked to a university. And it's been linked to Monash University ever since, but that's largely for academic and a few other reasons.
But it's been hugely successful, to put it mildly, hasn't it, since that was formed?
So success begets success in a way. So, you have a successful grant application, you have a successful publication, then you get another one and another one. And I think right now, so this is now roughly 25 years later, we've enrolled around about 100,000 patients into these multi-centre randomised trials we've published. And we've had over $70 million of research funding for our major funding agents. I think we've now got a reputation, especially in Australia and New Zealand, that anaesthetists do research and we do high quality, impactful research. And that reputation, I think, is both well deserved and it's a credit to everybody. It's a whole network success.
What's next?
Well, I think the cost of doing these trials is going up and up. We've got so many trials we'd love to do. We simply can't squeeze them all in at the one time or even run them across our region and obviously globally now. So there's been a whole lot of innovations around trial design that can make them more efficient and lower cost and faster to get the answers that I think everybody wants. So this concept of an adaptive platform trial is where I'm putting all my efforts and energy, is to build up what was a centralized clinical trial platform that allows these questions to be literally just tapped into the system. They can start faster. They can be run concurrently with other questions measuring the same data, even within the same patients, and answer big questions in parallel and in series to allow us to get to the real answers or solve the clinical problems that we have.
And we've talked about platform trials and these adaptive designs in the past, but for our listeners at home that haven't heard all those episodes, what is it about a platform trial or that adaptive design that makes the trial better answer multiple questions more quickly?
Yeah, so it's loosely called a perpetual trial. The platform itself is the centralized system that has a single large database and statisticians and other expertise. All the trial sites that might be part of the network, and simply the location where the patients are being enrolled, the expertise and complexity is centralized. So the average site doesn't need to worry too much about that. And patients can be enrolled into more than one trial that exists within the platform at any one time, so that we can run effectively 3 or 4 trials at the one time. And as you answer one of the big questions and that trial completes, you can add in another trial that can start literally a month later rather than a year later, sort of thing. And that whole process becomes much more efficient.
So exciting times ahead.
I think so. I've had a lot of success in doing these big trials and gaining funding, as have many of my colleagues in Australia, New Zealand and elsewhere. I see one of my responsibilities is to help build up this platform in a way that can actually future-proof our ability as anaesthetists and perioperative physicians to do these sort of trials in a way that are much easier, and that people don't have to have the same battles I had back in the 80s and early 90s.
Well, that leads me nicely on to two questions to finish. If someone is wanting to get into this research space now in anaesthesia, in perioperative medicine, intensive care medicine, how should they do that? What route should they follow? What journey should they take?
You need some ambition in it, and you have to be motivated. And of course, people are often looking for the expertise or mentor that is clearly needed. I would advise anyone that hasn't got that expertise in their own hospital or their own region, just reach out, and there's often people in other parts of the country that can provide that, even through a distance online process. And of course, if your hospitals are not yet involved in these multi-centre trials, then reach out and contact, in our case in Australia, through the ANZCA Clinical Trials Network, the Perioperative Medicine Clinical Trial Network, and there are others in other parts. So try and get your hospital involved in these studies. If you really have a strong personal interest in developing a career in research, then I would strongly advise that you have that extra basic training. And that one example is a Master of Public Health or a Master of Clinical Epidemiology or something similar, so that you actually gain those extra skills that help you get a lot more value out of the effort you might put in.
Fantastic advice as always. And my second question to finish. So where should I go to learn to surf?
There's surfing everywhere, of course. You just need a coast. So there's great surfing here in the UK, in the southwest especially, in Wales and Scotland and so on. If you do come to Australia, anywhere on the coast, like anaesthesia, you start with small waves, do the simple things first, have the experience of wiping out over and over again, and it just gets better.
Brilliant.
Great.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for joining us on TopMedTalk's first Periop profile, Paul.
Great. Thank you, Andy.
TopMedTalk. Thanks for downloading TopMedTalk. Don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and of course on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and X. Also, it's important to remember that TopMedTalk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that, and the way to do that is ebpom.org. Check out our website and find out about some of the incredible conferences we're going to be arranging across the year. ebpom.org.